Have you ever caught yourself doing something unusual, a habit you can't quite explain? Perhaps you're drawn to a culture you've never visited, or you have an inexplicable fear that doesn't match your life experiences. These subtle patterns might be whispers from another time. In the quiet hills of Virginia Beach, a humble man named Edgar Cayce discovered something profound about the human soul. Through thousands of readings conducted while in a trance state, he revealed that our souls carry memories across lifetimes. These memories don't always stay hidden in the unconscious mind. They often emerge as preferences, talents, and yes, even those strange little habits we can't explain. Think about it. The child who sits at a piano for the first time and somehow knows where to place their fingers. The person who feels an overwhelming sense of homecoming in a foreign country they've never visited. The unexplainable phobia of water in someone who's never had a traumatic experience with it. These aren't just quirks of personality, they might be echoes from your soul's longer journey. Isabella from Connecticut wrote to the Association for Research and Enlightenment about her lifelong habit of saving small pieces of bread. "I've always done it since I was little," she explained. "I wrap them carefully and hide them, feeling anxious if I don't have this little reserve." When she explored this compulsion through meditation and reflection, techniques Cayce often recommended, she connected with a profound sense of having once experienced extreme hunger during a period of scarcity. This is what Cayce called soul memory, experiences so deeply imprinted that they transcend a single lifetime. The scientific community continues to debate the concept of reincarnation, but even Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist, spoke of the collective unconscious, a shared memory and experience that extends beyond our individual lives. What Cayce suggested goes further, that your soul carries specific memories unique to its journey. Take a moment now to reflect. What habits do you have that seem to have appeared from nowhere? What skills came naturally to you, as if your hands or mind already knew what to do? Are there places that call to you though you've never been there? In the American experience, we often emphasize starting fresh, creating ourselves anew. But perhaps true self-understanding requires looking deeper, acknowledging that we arrive with certain patterns already in place. The Midwestern farmer who feels strangely comfortable holding ancient tools. The New York executive who finds peace only when near the ocean. The child in suburban America who describes details of historical periods with uncanny accuracy. These aren't just coincidences or imagination. According to Cayce's readings, they're the subtle influences of soul memory, memories that survived. The transition between lifetimes. When we recognize these patterns, we gain insight not just into our quirks, but into our soul's longer journey. We begin to understand the deeper purpose behind our attractions and aversions, our natural talents, and inexplicable fears. As Cayce often emphasized in his readings, becoming aware of these patterns doesn't mean we're bound by them. Rather, this awareness offers us the opportunity to work with them consciously, to heal old wounds, to develop latent talents, and to fulfill the purpose that our soul has been working toward across many lifetimes. What happens when we begin to see our quirks, not as random traits, but as meaningful connections to our soul's longer journey? The implications ripple through every aspect of our lives, from our relationships to our deepest fears, from our natural talents to our most persistent challenges. Edgar Cayce's readings suggest that we don't just carry vague impressions from past lives, we carry specific patterns, relationships, and even physical tendencies. The body, Cayce taught, is the temple of the soul, and it bears the marks of experiences that transcend this current lifetime. Consider Thomas, a high school teacher from Oregon, who shared his story with the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment. Since childhood, he had experienced an unusual physical reaction. His throat would tighten inexplicably in certain situations, particularly when he felt vulnerable or exposed. No medical explanation could be found. Through deep meditative work inspired by Cayce's readings, Thomas connected with a vivid impression of having once died by hanging. The physical memory had persisted, manifesting as a protective mechanism, warning him of perceived danger. Understanding this didn't make the sensation disappear overnight, Thomas explained, but it gave it meaning. I could work with it rather than just suffer through it. This is the profound shift that Cayce's perspective offers, seeing our peculiarities not as random afflictions, but as meaningful communications from the deeper self. The soul speaks through the body, through our instinctive reactions, through our inexplicable knowings. Think of the child who shows an extraordinary affinity for mathematics without formal training, or the person who instinctively knows how to calm anxious animals, or the individual who can navigate complex social situations with unusual wisdom. Cayce would suggest these aren't just genetic gifts or lucky accidents. They're skills developed over multiple lifetimes, now resurfacing when needed. In the American context, we often emphasize reinvention and new beginnings. The pioneer spirit, the immigrant journey, the self-made success, all celebrate the power to start anew. Yet Cayce's readings suggest that true freedom comes not from erasing the past, but from integrating it. Our soul's longer memory isn't a limitation. It's a resource, a wellspring of wisdom and capability that we can draw upon. Dr. Elizabeth Moore, a psychologist practicing in Massachusetts, incorporates Cayce-inspired approaches in her work with patients. When someone has a persistent pattern that doesn't respond to conventional therapy, I sometimes invite them to consider a longer timeline, she explains, not necessarily jumping to past lives, but opening to the possibility that some patterns may have roots beyond their current life experience. She describes a patient with an intense fear of abandonment that couldn't be traced to any childhood trauma. When they explored the possibility that this fear might originate from experiences beyond this lifetime, the woman connected with a profound sense of having been left behind during a time of war or disaster. This insight didn't immediately resolve her fear, but it placed it in a context that made more sense than her relatively stable upbringing. The relief was visible, Dr. Moore recalls, not because we'd found a magical explanation, but because her experience finally had a framework that matched its intensity. This framework is what Cayce offers, a way to understand our deepest patterns not as random quirks or neuroses, but as meaningful aspects of our soul's development. The executive who feels trapped in corporate life might be working through power dynamics from another time. The artist who creates images of landscapes they've never seen might be drawing on soul memory. The person with an inexplicable passion for social justice might be continuing work begun long ago. Cayce's readings also emphasize that these patterns aren't simply replaying without purpose. Rather, each lifetime presents opportunities to resolve old tensions, heal old wounds, and evolve beyond old limitations. The soul seeks growth and completion. This perspective transforms how we view our most challenging traits. The tendency toward anger, the struggle with trust, the difficulty with abundance. These aren't just flaws to be corrected, but soul lessons to be integrated. As one Cayce reading states, "For what is the purpose of life? That ye may know yourself to be yourself, yet one with the creative forces." Reading 2031. Consider how this might change your relationship with your own unexplained habits or tendencies. The woman who always needs to sit with her back to the wall in restaurants, the man who compulsively stores supplies despite living in abundance, the child who shows unusual compassion toward specific types of suffering. Each pattern carries information about the soul's journey, not to bind us to the past, but to illuminate our path forward. In American society, where pragmatism often outweighs spiritual exploration, Cayce's approach offers a middle path. It doesn't require blind belief, but rather thoughtful observation of patterns in your own life. It invites you to be both scientist and explorer of your inner landscape, gathering evidence and forming hypotheses about your soul's longer journey. James, a businessman from Chicago, described how this perspective transformed his approach to his own life. "I used to fight against my tendency to be overly cautious with money. I thought it made me seem weak or fearful. When I considered it might be connected to experiences of extreme poverty in another time, I could work with it more compassionately. I could honor the wisdom in that caution while also recognizing when it was holding me back unnecessarily." This is the heart of Cayce's teaching on past lives, not using them as an excuse for current limitations, but as a source of insight that enables more conscious choice in the present. The patterns don't disappear, but our relationship to them transforms. We move from being unconsciously driven by them to consciously working with them. The journey of recognizing our soul's deeper patterns isn't always dramatic or obvious. Unlike Hollywood portrayals of past life memories, where characters suddenly collapse into full-blown visions of another time, the real experience tends to be more subtle, more integrated into the fabric of everyday life. Edgar Cayce described it not as sensational flashes, but as a gradual awakening to the threads that connect our present experience to our soul's longer journey. So how do we begin to recognize these threads in our own lives? How do we distinguish between ordinary preferences and deeper soul patterns. The signs are often hiding in plain sight, woven into the seemingly mundane aspects of our daily experience. Consider the persistent dreams that revisit you throughout your life. Not the random dreams that fade by morning, but those that stay with you for years. Dreams of places you've never visited, situations you've never encountered, yet they feel hauntingly familiar. Cayce suggested that dreams offer a window where the soul communicates more directly, less filtered by the conscious mind's limitations. Marianne, a librarian from Seattle, described a recurring dream she'd had since childhood. I'm in a stone building with high ceilings and narrow windows. I'm searching for something important, scrolls or books, and there's a sense of urgency, like knowledge that needs to be preserved. Though she'd never been in such a place in her waking life, the dream carried an emotional reality that ordinary fantasies lacked. Years later, when she visited a medieval monastery in Europe, she experienced a profound sense of recognition. It wasn't exactly like my dream, but the feeling was identical. That sense of being responsible for preserving knowledge through difficult times. This sense of déjà vu, the feeling of having been somewhere before, of knowing something you shouldn't know, is another common signpost of soul memory. Not the fleeting déjà vu that comes and goes in seconds, but the profound recognition that sometimes washes over us in certain places or situations. Robert, a carpenter from rural Pennsylvania, described his first visit to the Southwest. I'd never been west of the Mississippi, grew up in a completely different landscape, but when I stood on the edge of a particular mesa in New Mexico, I knew what was on the other side before I looked. I knew where certain paths would lead. It wasn't just familiar, it was known to me in my bones. Cayce's readings suggest that such experiences aren't coincidences or quirks of brain chemistry, but moments when the veil between our current awareness and our soul's deeper knowledge becomes temporarily transparent. These moments deserve our attention, not as proof to convince others, but as personal signposts guiding us toward greater self-understanding. Unexplained physical reactions often serve as another pathway to soul memory. The body, according to Cayce, holds its own form of memory, cellular imprints that can manifest as inexplicable reactions, skills, or limitations. The person who flinches at the sound of gunfire, despite never having experienced violence. The untrained hands that somehow know how to work with clay or weave or build. The throat that constricts when trying to speak certain truths, as if remembering a time when speaking out led to danger. Dr. Richard Harmon, a physician who studied Cayce's work extensively, observed these patterns in his medical practice in Virginia. I've seen patients with pain conditions that don't correspond to any physical injury in this lifetime. When we approach these conditions with openness to the possibility of deeper patterns, perhaps from other times, we sometimes find healing pathways that conventional medicine missed. He described a patient with chronic wrist pain that had no apparent physical cause. When they explored the possibility of a soul memory connection, the man had a clear impression of having been restrained or shackled. Working with this awareness, not as an abstract belief but as a practical approach to healing, they developed a treatment plan that included not just physical therapy, but also emotional release work focused on themes of confinement and freedom. With the Mao, pain didn't disappear overnight, Dr. Harmon explained, but it began to shift as he worked consciously with this deeper pattern. What had been a mysterious affliction became a meaningful part of his healing journey. This integration of the physical and spiritual aspects of healing was central to Cayce's approach. He didn't separate body and soul into disconnected compartments, but recognized their profound interconnection, how soul patterns manifest in physical reality, and how physical experiences shape the soul's understanding. Perhaps the most telling, signs of soul memory appear in our inexplicable attractions and aversions, the immediate, sometimes overwhelming responses we have to certain people, places, or activities, the instant trust or distrust we feel toward someone we've just met, the powerful draw toward a particular culture, historical period, or spiritual tradition, the visceral discomfort with specific situations that seem harmless to others. Amanda, a college professor from Vermont, described her lifelong fascination with ancient Egypt. It wasn't just academic interest. From my earliest memories, I felt a personal connection to the imagery, the hieroglyphs, the religious concepts. When I finally visited Egypt in my 30s, I walked through the temple at Karnak and found myself silently naming parts of the structure. In my mind, I knew what certain spaces were for, what would have happened there. Later, I verified that many of my impressions aligned with archaeological understanding. She doesn't claim this as proof of reincarnation, but acknowledges it as a meaningful pattern in her life's journey. Whether it's literally a past life or some other form of connection doesn't matter as much to me as the fact that this knowledge helps me understand my own path. It helped me recognize why I was drawn to my field of study, why certain philosophical questions have always felt personally important to me. This approach, holding the possibility of soul memory without demanding absolute proof, aligns with Cayce's often pragmatic focus. In his readings, he emphasized the practical value of recognizing these patterns rather than using them to feed spiritual curiosity or ego identification. The point wasn't to discover you had been someone important in another time, but to understand the lessons your soul is working to learn across lifetimes. As one Cayce reading stated, "For life and its expressions are one. Each soul or entity will and does return, or cycle, as does nature in its manifestations about man, thus leaving, making, or presenting, as it were, those infallible, indelible truths that life is continuous." Reading 938, 1. This continuity of life experience creates patterns that we can learn to recognize and work with consciously, but doing so requires a certain quality of attention, a willingness to observe ourselves with greater awareness and deeper curiosity. Dr. Isabella Kendrick, a psychologist practicing in Arizona, incorporates Cayce-inspired approaches in her work with patients. "I don't start by introducing past life concepts, but I do invite people to notice patterns that seem to have no obvious origin in their current life experience. I ask them to approach these patterns with curiosity rather than judgment." She described working with a client who had an intense, seemingly irrational fear of starvation, despite growing up in comfortable circumstances. We explored this fear with openness to deeper patterns. Through guided meditation and dream work, she connected with a vivid sense of having experienced severe deprivation during a time of famine. This wasn't presented as absolute truth, but as a meaningful framework that helped her understand the intensity of her fear. The therapeutic result was significant. Once she could place this fear in a larger context, seeing it as part of her soul's longer experience rather than an irrational quirk, she could work with it differently. The fear didn't instantly disappear, but she developed a more compassionate relationship with it. She could recognize when it was offering useful caution and when it was an outdated response to conditions that no longer existed. This shift, from being unconsciously driven by our patterns to consciously working with them, represents the core of what Cayce offered through his understanding of soul memory. The patterns themselves aren't the problem, it's our unconscious relationship to them that creates limitation. When brought into awareness, even our most challenging tendencies can become doorways to greater understanding and freedom. John, a military veteran from Texas, described how this perspective transformed his experience with anger. "I always had a hair-trigger temper, even before my combat experience. It seemed hardwired into me. When I started studying Cayce's work, I became curious about this pattern. Through meditation and prayer, I connected with a strong impression of having been both a victim and perpetrator of violence in other times. My anger wasn't just random, it was carrying information about my soul's longer journey with power, vulnerability, and justice. This understanding didn't justify his anger, but gave it context that allowed for healing. I could see my temper as something my soul was working to transform across lifetimes, not just a personal failing. That perspective gave me both responsibility for changing the pattern and compassion for how deeply rooted it was. The American cultural context adds particular dimensions to this exploration. In a society that often emphasizes individual achievement and personal reinvention, Cayce's perspective suggests a more continuous view of identity, one where our current life builds upon foundations laid in other times. This doesn't diminish personal responsibility, but places it in a larger context of soul development. For many Americans raised in religious traditions that don't include reincarnation, Cayce's approach can initially seem foreign, yet his readings consistently emphasize that recognizing the soul's longer journey doesn't contradict core spiritual teachings about divine love and human purpose. Rather, it offers a framework that helps explain the profound differences we observe in human talents, tendencies, and challenges from the earliest age. The child prodigy who plays complex music without training, the individual with a natural gift for languages, the person who shows wisdom beyond their years. These variations make more sense if we understand human development as extending beyond a single lifetime, if we recognize that we arrive with different levels of soul development in different areas. But how do we begin working more consciously with these patterns once we recognize them? Cayce offered several approaches, many of which align with both spiritual traditions and modern psychological understanding. Meditation and prayer create the quiet space where deeper patterns can be recognized, not forcing specific memories to emerge, but cultivating receptivity to the soul's wider awareness. Dream work offers a pathway to soul memory, as the sleeping mind is less bound by the limitations of conscious thought. Keeping a dream journal and looking for recurring themes can reveal patterns that connect to your soul's longer journey. Creative expression, through art, music, writing, or movement, sometimes bypasses the analytical mind and allows soul memory to emerge in symbolic form. The hands that somehow know how to form clay, the voice that carries songs never learned, the body that remembers dances from another time. Places of power, locations where you feel a strong resonance or recognition, can serve as doorways to deeper awareness. These might be historical sites, natural landscapes, or simply places that call to you without obvious reason. Relationships often carry soul memory, particularly those with an immediate sense of recognition or a depth of connection that exceeds the time you've known each other. Paying attention to these connections can reveal patterns of soul development across lifetimes. Laura, a teacher from New Mexico, described such a connection with her daughter. From the moment she was born, there was a sense that we knew each other beyond this lifetime. As she grew, she would sometimes say things about "when I was big and you were little," seeming to reference a different relationship we'd shared. I don't try to determine exactly what that might have been, but I honor the depth of connection it represents. This approach, curious, open, but not fixated on specific details, characterizes the healthiest engagement with soul memory. The point isn't to construct elaborate stories about past identities, but to recognize the patterns that inform your current life purpose and path of development. As Cayce frequently emphasized, the value lies not in identifying with who you might have been, but in understanding who you are becoming, how your soul is evolving through experiences across multiple lifetimes. This perspective transforms how we view both our strengths and our challenges. Our talents aren't just random gifts, but capacities developed through dedicated effort across time. Our struggles aren't just bad luck, but opportunities to resolve patterns that have persisted across lifetimes. With this understanding, life becomes less random and more purposeful, a meaningful journey of soul development unfolding according to patterns deeper than we can fully comprehend, yet accessible enough to guide our conscious choices in this present lifetime.